So once again, in today's web dev tip, we're going to carry on with our end-to-end project. And what we're going to be doing in this tutorial is logging back onto our server and setting up Nginx to work with the domain that we're going to be using for our project. So the domain name has been purchased, and we'll see how to actually point the domain to our DigitalOcean droplet in the next tutorial or a following tutorial. But what we need to do first is make some configuration files within Nginx to actually say that we're going to be using the particular domain so that when we get a request that is pointing to the domain which is received by our droplet, we actually display the right content. And we also, as a side note as well, need to create a folder for our web content as well on the server so that we can keep it separate and enabling us to serve multiple projects on the same server if we need to. So there's a lot going on here, but let's log on to our server and get started. So let's go SSH, and instead of root this time, I'll say rickandroll. And we should just be able to log straight on there. And so just really quickly, what we're going to do first of all is create the folder for our content, and that'll be available within our pipeline to actually push our code once it's built. So we're going to make a directory, and there's this special folder inside of our droplet that's been set up, and it's inside of the root and then var folder, and then there's this www folder which is where Nginx will keep all of its web content. And there is some content in there already at the moment. There's the default content that we saw yesterday, the placeholder web page, but we're going to create a separate folder for our project. And I'm going to use the domain name that we're using for our project now as well, so that we know exactly what web content is going to be served. So inside of there, we're going to have a HTML directory. You don't need to have this, but again, it's a convention that's usually followed. So we're making a directory in this location. And just so you know, this -p flag will create any of the subdirectories if they don't already exist. So if we run that and just enter our password, and you can see we don't get a confirmation, but that has completed successfully because we didn't get any errors. And we're just going to make sure that we make sure that the permissions for that particular folder are set correctly. So, whoops, I missed / there. So rickandroll.me. So we're just being a little bit security conscious and just making sure that no other users on the droplet can accidentally update the files in this folder. Okay, so now is the tricky bit, creating the Nginx configuration files. And I say it's tricky just because there's lots of information inside of the file that we need to put in. So some of this might seem a bit confusing, but I will put a link to a gist or something similar, just so you can copy and paste this if you need to for your own projects. But essentially, we're going to navigate into the Nginx configuration files folder, and this is inside /etc/Nginx. And if you have a look inside there, there's lots of different configuration files that we don't need to worry about too much. But the one thing I'd like to point out is that you've got two folders here. We've got sites available. So this is where we configure all of the sites that Nginx could potentially serve. And then in sites enabled, we actually put something called a symbolic link inside there, which links back to the sites available for any sites that we want Nginx to actually serve. So what we're going to do is actually create a new file inside of sites available. And we're going to create a new file with the same name as the domain name that we're going to be using. And notice we've got to use the sudo command here because this is in a restricted part where you need administrative privileges. So we'll just run that. And now we're in the Nano text editor, and we need to put some stuff in here to actually create some configuration for our website to actually be displayed with Nginx. So there is a fair bit of configuration that we need to put into here, and rather than typing that out and potentially making lots of mistakes in the tutorial, I'm just going to paste in an example of one of these configuration files, and I'll talk you through some of the points. We need to make a few changes to make it work with our domain. But essentially we have a server block which tells Nginx that this is a web server, and we're listening on port 80 for web traffic. We'll deal with HTTPS in a following tutorial. And then we're setting the root folder for the project. And you'll notice there that this is pointing to /var www, and obviously we want to replace this with the domain that we're using. So you'll notice that matches exactly what we just created in the previous step. And then the next line is just saying that we want to use the default files in here. So we've got index.html, etc. To look for web content. And then we're going to set the domain here too. So we'll say rickandroll.me, and we're also going to be serving content on www as well. So let's say rickandroll.me. And that's enough to get our web content served. Actually, we don't need to do anything else, but we've got this other section inside of our server block, which is specifying a location. So you can create specific meanings for different endpoints or different paths on your domain. So here we've got one set up saying location /API, and we're going to redirect any traffic to that particular path to somewhere else. So where are we going to redirect it to? Well, we're redirecting it to something that's not available yet, but will be shortly, and that is the API that we're going to be running on our particular droplet. And the API will be what we've created already on our local machine that handles the creation of the short URLs and also the redirect itself. So we could create this dynamically and put in a variable for the specific port that's going to be used, but we're going to keep it simple and just say that the port we're going to be using is the 3333 port, which, if you remember from the previous tutorials, is the port that we're using on our API service that we're running locally at the moment. So the rest of the content in here is just some special Nginx rules to ensure that we're passing all of those requests to that particular node service. But as I say, I'll put a link to a gist for this so you don't have to remember all of this. You can just copy and paste it into your own configuration files if you need to. And that's pretty much it. I don't think there's anything else here that we need to change. Everything else is pretty standard. There's a rule down here just in case we don't find a particular path and we don't get a response and we get a 404, but that shouldn't really be too much of a problem because we'll be using a single page app which will catch everything in the index as well. So, but we can leave that there just in case we want to serve 404s for any reason. Okay, so once that's set up, we just write that out using the Control O in the Nano text editor, and then just exit and go back to the terminal. So once we've created a configuration file for a particular site, we can just check that's available. If we check in the sites available folder, so we've got a default configuration, which is what Nginx is using at the moment, and also the new configuration file that we created for rickandroll.me. But I mentioned earlier we need to make sure that sites enabled knows about this configuration file, otherwise Nginx won't actually serve any content to us. So the way we do that is by creating a symbolic link with the ln command and pass in the -s flag, and then we're going to link what we've got inside of the Nginx sites available folder and make sure we've got the rick and roll domain. And then we're going to link that so that it's available inside of /etc Nginx and then sites enabled. If we run that. And if we have a look now inside of sites enabled, you'll see the rickandroll.me configuration file is now inside of there, as well as the sites available file. And if we do the ls command again, but with some extra flags to display some additional information, and then have a look at sites enabled again, you can see here we've got an L next to the rickandroll.me configuration file that we've got, and you can see where it's pointing to as well. So that is a symbolic link. So it means that you don't need to change the configuration files in two places. You just need to go into the sites available folder if you need to make any tweaks or changes. So we can test our configuration is correct in Nginx by running nginx-t, and I need to run that with sudo as well, just so that it's got the correct permissions. And the -t option will just check that the configuration file is okay. So we can see here that the configuration that we've got set up is okay. And also the sites available, if there are any errors in there, it will actually flag those up here and tell you that there's a problem loading that site. So everything looks pretty good. But just before we finish up, there's one final thing I'm going to do. So if you remember in the var www folder, we're just going to create a simple index.html file in our rickandroll.me folder. And that will mean when we link our domain, we'll be able to check visually in our browser that the setup is complete. So let's just navigate into the var www folder and then rickandroll.me. If we have a look inside of there, we've got the HTML folder, so let's just navigate inside of there, because that's where we set the root for our project within Nginx. And then inside of here, open a text editor for index.html, and we'll just put some simple content in there saying rick and roll project is live. and an exclamation mark there as well. So we'll save that by writing it out, Control O and then Control X to get back to the terminal. And we'll just use that as a quick test. So when we link the domain to the droplet and Nginx is serving that content, we should see that message when we browse to our URL. So there you go, we've covered a lot in this tutorial. We created a folder for our web content. We created a configuration file for Nginx, and we also made sure that the site was enabled. And then we tested that configuration to make sure it was okay. And then finally, we just created a simple index.html file to display on our domain once the domain's been pointed to the droplet. So in the next tutorial, we'll look at linking the domain to the droplet, but that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.